There, everybody. How are you? Welcome back to MTRA Bedtime Stories. We're starting a new book tonight. We did enjoy Misty, though, didn't we? I found this book called Hoofbeats. It's written by Margaret and Flynn, and it was written in 1875. And it's a story about a girl and a horse, and it's based on historical facts. So I thought, let's give it a try. We might enjoy it. So we're going to start chapter 1, and here we go. On Independence Day, I went to the well before sunup. Mrs. Frederickson's place is on a little rise. Not much of one, but it's all flat as Johnny cakes out to the east, so I could see all the way to the horizon in that direction. And I saw something. I just couldn't see clear. I squinted in the dawn dusk at a blurry darkness rolling above the grassland. I could smell smoke, but the breeze was blowing the wrong way. Maybe it was dust. I hope so. We had no rain for a few weeks. It was probably dry enough for a cattle drive to kick up a brown cloud if the herd was big enough. I didn't want it to be smoke. Smoke meant fire, and if it was a big fire, we'd have to run for it, and then we might end up never coming back here again. Libby took almost any excuse to move on. She liked roaming, staying 2 steps ahead of trouble, she called it. I didn't. I liked it when we stayed in one place for a while. And I liked Mrs. Frederickson more and more. Libby didn't trust her, but Libby almost never trusted anybody. I pulled a long breath. No smoke smell yet. I wanted to wait a few minutes, see if the breeze would change once the sun was up. But I knew if I stood there much longer, Libby would get upset with me for dawdling. I set the full water bucket by the path that ran for the barn. Mrs. Frederickson had let her wheat fields go fallow and had sold off all her cattle, but she still kept a big garden and had a milk cow named Bessie and 2 horses, Benny and Tish. The horses woke and nickered when they heard me slide the barn door back. I lit the lantern and hung it up and then said good morning to them both. They were pretty bays, calm and sweet, the way horses always are if someone is kind to them. And Mrs. Frederickson was old, but she was still sort of pretty and with high cheekbones and long slim-fingered nails that were graceful, no matter what chore she was doing. Her hair was so long that she never wore it down, instead twisting and winding it into an intricate bun. The first day we met her, she told us that she was a widow who had raised 2 sons and a daughter. Only the daughter was still alive, raising her own family in Denver City now. I had never asked Mrs. Frederickson anything more about her sons, and I never would. Neither would Libby. We were the last 2 to pester anyone to talk about their sorrows. On our second day with her, I had asked Mrs. Frederickson if I could ride her horses. She had stared at my eyes and made me promise to be careful, not to hurt myself or the horses. Then she had said that her husband had ridden off to check the wheat fields to visit a neighbor to go to town, but she didn't go much of any place anymore, only a few times a year in the wagon to Littleton for dry goods. Benny is old, but Tish loves a good gallop, she told me. I'd be happy if she got one now and then. The first time I took Tish out, I discovered there was only one saddle in the barn. The cinch was old and frayed, and one of the stirrup leathers had rotted and split. So I rode bareback, which I liked better anyway. Tish really did like to gallop still, especially in the cool of the morning or evening. She was a little uneasy with me riding bareback at first, but then had gotten used to it. Libby hated me riding, but she didn't forbid me, partly because she knew how much I loved it, and partly because she could see how placid and calm Tish was. A baby could have ridden her. Libby had always been afraid of horses. I was the opposite. They all felt like old friends to me. Everywhere we had ever lived, I had ridden every chance I got. Something about riding eased my heart and made me happy. My dearest hope was to one day have a horse of my own. I had told Libby that just once. She had explained in a voice that made me feel small and stupid that we could barely feed ourselves, much less a horse, and she forbade me to bring it up again. Every morning I let Bonnie and Tish out to graze in the railed fence pasture. This morning I watched them for a moment as I slid the fence rails back into place, closing them in. Neither of them acted the least bit nervous. They were breathing deep and slow, grazing without lifting their heads to look around for danger. So it wasn't smoke, or the wind was so far wrong that not even they could smell it yet. I went back to the barn and tossed Bessie some of the dried grass piled outside her stall, and then poured half a pail of cracked corn into her manger. I walked back toward the little sod house, the ding-dang water bucket dripping on my right shoe all the way. I kept glancing at the horizon, squinting, wishing the sun would hurry out. I thought I could still see the dark place. Maybe not. It had been a mile or two off, whatever it was, maybe farther. So even if it was smoke, the fire might not come close unless the wind came up. Would that soddy burn? I didn't see how it could. It was built from scrapped old slabs of dirt held together by the roots of wiry grass that covered the prairie. Mrs. Fredrickson told me that she and her husband had cut the squares and stacked them like oversized bricks years before. The soddy roof had timbers, but they were covered in the sod. I stared into the dusky distance for one more long moment, standing on the porch. I couldn't see even a glimmer of fire shine. It had to be dust. When I pushed open the unlatched door, my sister was bent over, blowing the hearth fire back to life, raking the coals to one side to bake bread later. Our bedding was neatly folded in the far corner, and she had swept the plank floor. There was a mound of brownish dough on the sideboard. My mouth watered. There would be fresh sourdough bread in a few hours. My sister was a very good cook. I sat down the bucket beside the little pine board dresser that held the skillets and pot rags and waited for Libby to finish. She didn't like being interrupted at anything that she was doing. Mrs. Fredrickson was still abed in her room, walled off from the rest of the soddy by rough plaster walls. She slept later than we did sometimes, but not by much. I wasn't sure how old she was. Her hair was white, and her daughter Colleen was her youngest. She had said that much. She said Colleen visited sometimes, but not nearly often enough now that she was married to a Denver City banker and had 2 children of her own. Mrs. Fredrickson hadn't sounded upset saying that, but kind of sad. They were lovely children, Mrs. Fredrickson told us, sweet-natured and a joy. Staring at my sister, waiting for her to turn around, I thought about that. Banker's kids. What would that be like, living in a big house, staying put, not going off somewhere new 2 or 3 times a year? My sister straightened up and saw me standing there waiting. She made an impatient gesture. What? I saw something, Libby. She frowned and shook her head and made the gesture again. There's dust, I told her. I think, or smoke. Come look. Libby straightened her shoulders. Close. I shook my head. A mile or 2 off to the east. Maybe 3 or 4. I can't tell. The sun is barely up. Could be buffalo dust. I watched her nudge the kindling farther back in the hearth. Then she hung the log hook on the wall rack. When she turned to face me again, she shooed me with her hands. Don't stand and gawk at me, Margaret. If there's something to worry about, we'll know soon enough. Go get firewood. I need to wash our clothes today. But it's only Saturday, I said. Monday's laundry includes the bedding, she told me, and I needed no further explanation. Bedding would be back-breaking enough without clothes added in. So I went back out, headed for the woodshed this time, wishing Libby would come look at the dust or whatever it was. But I knew better than to argue with her. It was like arguing with a rock. Going up the path, I wished Libby would stop acting like I was still a baby. She was 17, 6 years older than me, and the only family I had ever had. She had been 7 when we were orphaned. I had been a few months shy of turning 2. I can't remember our parents at all. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. Libby wouldn't tell me anything either. When I first started asking Libby, had said it didn't matter all that much. Then she would pepper me with questions. We had stayed clear of Mr. Lincoln's war, hadn't we? We had stayed safe and sound in Iowa, hadn't we? And we were making our way all right, just two of us, weren't we? And all that was true, but I still wanted to know about our parents. Mrs. Frederickson's little sod shed was stacked full of split pine logs cut to stove. There were no pine trees within 10 miles or more. In fact, there were hardly any trees at all except for the cottonwoods along the river, and cottonwood doesn't hold a coal much longer than twisted paper. Mrs. Frederickson had told us the wood had been freighted in by a man who bought it from somewhere west of Denver and had cut, split, and seasoned it. Mrs. Frederickson's daughter had drawn him a map and paid him to haul it here, stack it in the shed, then go back to Denver. She had arranged the same thing the year before, too. Mrs. Frederickson's saying that made me feel like I had seen a pig fly past. How much money do you have to feel like you can spend it on something as silly as that? The rest of the settlers along this stretch of the South Platte River burned wood from trees they planted for the purpose, or they still did what the first settlers had done. They burned dried buffalo and cow dung for winter months. Stay warm and all year to cook, too. It worked fine. On any clear day, I could see 3 other farmhouses from Mrs. Frederickson's chicken coop on the south side of the Saudi, and as long as we had been there, I had seen specks moving in long zigzags along the cow pastures in the unfenced land. There was the littlest children in each family, stopping, bending, walking again. They were picking up buffalo and cow chips. Mrs. Frederickson wasn't young, but she was tough as saddle leather, and she could have picked up her own buffalo chips. She could carry a feed sack of buffalo patties all day and not be weary. Almost nobody could. They aren't heavy, or she could fashion a little painter rig for Tish or Benny. Either one would welcome the exercise and the diversion. And Mrs. Frederickson wouldn't have minded. She worked hard at something or other all day long. The wood was her daughter's idea, and I was pretty sure I knew why. Pauline and her family lived in Denver City, and she almost never came to visit. She probably felt bad and wanted to do something for her mother, and she probably worried too, knowing that Mrs. Frederickson was out here on her own. I looked to the east on my way back up the hill. The smoke, or whatever it had been, was gone, and now that the sun was above the horizon, I could see that the sky was pocketed with gray clouds. Maybe laundry should wait. I think it's a storm blowing in, I told my sister as I walked back into the kitchen. She was kneading the dough, rocking back and forth as she worked. She half turned and jutted her chin out, pointing at the hearth. I'll go look in a minute, she said, slapping the dough. Would you get the Dutch oven greased up for me, then go milk? I did as I was told. I always do. Greasing the cast iron pot took 2 minutes, and then I was back outside. Bessie was glad to see me. I milked fast. We had lived on a dairy farm back in Nebraska. The Danners sold milk and made cheese, and the whole family rose before light to start milking, including us. I had thought at first that we had finally found a home. They needed hands and we needed a place, and they were nice enough to us. The trouble was between the two of them. Mrs. Dannon told us the story in fits and starts. When the army had come in and the Indian troubles had started again, she had wanted to go back east. Her husband didn't, so they stayed, but she was always scared. When statehood had come, they had disagreed about who should be able to vote, too, white men only or all men, so they both worked dawn to dark, barely speaking. It was a silent, unhappy house. One day, Mrs. Dannon scolded Libby hard for a small thing. That night, Libby woke me up, and we left by the light of the summer moon. Libby likes leaving places at night. That way, there's no argument. No one has ever found us. Maybe no one ever looked. I walked up the hill with the pail of warm milk, and when I came in the door, Libby was bent over her bread dough still. Once I had the milk strained and cooling, she turned to face me. Go gather up the eggs, she sounded irritated at me. I smiled at her. We'll have everything done by noon, at the rate we're going. Go, she said, shooing me with her flower-whitened hands. If it rains, we'll be glad of it. I can get the eggs. Mrs. Frederickson's voice came down the narrow hall. A moment later, she came into the kitchen. She pushed my hair back over my ears and kissed the top of my head. Good morning, dearie. She had done it every morning since we showed up at the door, asking to trade a meal or two for a little work, but it still amazed me. I saw Libby glance at us sidelong. She always gets wary if anyone is too nice to us. We need to start putting up more hard cheese, Mrs. Frederickson said, looking at the milk. She had been saying that since we arrived. It was true. Bessie gave more milk than the three of us used. Curds soured before we could eat them all. Hard cheese kept a lot longer. And how are you this morning, Mrs. Frederickson asked me. My sister had turned back to the bread dough. She said, I am fine, thank you, without so much as looking over her shoulder. I wish she would try harder to be nicer. This once, just a little. So far, I really liked it here. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Miss Elizabeth Quinn, Mrs. Frederickson answered, using my sister's whole name. Then she winked at me. Shall we go annoy the chickens? I ran to get the egg basket from its hook on the wall. The clothesline rope was coiled next to it. I reached for it. Don't bother with that if it looks like rain, Libby said. You'll still have one clean dress. I shook my head. Just my good one. Try not to wallow in the mud then, Libby said. I want to make a special supper for Independence Day, and I want you clean as possible at the table. Try not to wallow in the mud? Mrs. Frederickson gestured and we tiptoed out. Once we were outside, she stopped, as she always did, and stood very still, facing west. Then she lifted both of her hands and palms up, slanted toward the sky, and just stood there for a long moment, looking at the Rocky Mountains in the distance. I knew what was coming. She let out the long breath and doubled at the waist, folding up like a deck knife. Then she straightened again and lifted her hands skyward once more. She did it 3 times, then breathed long and slow as she straightened. Aren't you ever going to ask me? I blinked. I didn't want to be rude. She shook her head. Nothing rude about healthy curiosity. An Oriental fellow I met in California taught me. He said it would make me live longer. All I know is that it sets me right every morning. I had no idea what to say to that. Mrs. Frederickson wasn't like anyone else I had ever known. She and her husband had gone all the way to California during the gold rush of '49, then come back to Colorado Territory to homestead. He had lived, she had told me, they were going to go on up to the Oregon Territory to see some kind of redwooded trees that were 10 times the size of a big pine. She hadn't looked like she was joking. You are supposed to face east toward the sun, she said. I face west because William's grave is up there on the far side of the pasture. He was my son for 35 years, she paused and smiled, and now you know why I cannot live at any other house, and I cannot move to Denver the way Colleen wants me to. I can't leave William. Her voice was so full of love that I could not form a single thought for a moment. Then, when I did it, it was not one thought, but 4 or 5. I wished her husband was still alive, then I felt glad that he wasn't. If he had been, that she might not have taken us in seriously. And of course, the instant I thought that, I felt terrible. How could I be that selfish? What are you thinking, Miss Margaret? She asked me. As we walked around the end of the porch to the far side of the soddy, the chicken coop was built against the south-facing wall. I had no idea what to say again. I wasn't really thinking anything, and what I had felt was too strange to try to explain. She glanced at me, and I blinked and blushed a little, then a low roll of thunder made us both look eastward. Storm coming, she said, from the southeast in black clouds, so it'll likely be a whopper. I nodded. I thought I saw smoke this morning, or buffalo dust. I described the odd dark shape I had seen in the dawn dusk. She tipped her head and raised her eyebrows. I wonder if you saw a tornado. It's certainly late in the season to get one. She looked back eastward, and I felt my heart thudding in my chest. I had never seen a tornado, and I didn't want to see one now. Let's get the eggs in, Mrs. Frederickson said. Sometimes when there is one tornado, there's more. I nodded and went into the coop, sliding my hand beneath each hen as gently as I could. We found 9 eggs, and Mrs. Frederickson smiled. 9! We could make a cake for tonight's supper, and would still have enough for breakfast tomorrow. I smiled back at her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking up at the sky. An hour later, Mrs. Frederickson had me put the horses back in the barn. By noon, the sky had turned black and lightning crackled overhead. The clouds were so dark and the downpours of rain so heavy that even with the oil lamp lit, the little sod house was almost midnight dark, except when the lightning flashed. The blue-white light knifed through every tiny slit in the sod walls and the gaps around the door frame, flashing against the little wax paper window over the sideboard, and then, of course, the thunder came. Twice the lightning hit close by, and the thunder shook the packed earth beneath the floor planks. My sister sat in one of the kitchen chairs, her hands in her lap, her mouth set in a thin, tight line. "Libby?" She looked at me but didn't answer. "We'll be all right, won't we?" She nodded and made the motion with her hands that meant I was to leave her alone. I hated it sometimes, but I knew that if I kept trying to talk to her, she would just get angry, so I hushed. The oil lamp flickered, but there was nothing cheery about the little flame. Mrs. Frederickson was pacing the length of the kitchen, 4 steps back and 4 steps forth, and every 5 or 6 times she would push open the plank door and peek out. The first 10 times there was nothing but the sound of rain. The 11th time there was a sound like the whole world was screaming. Mrs. Frederickson jerked the door shut and barred it. Then she hooked her arm through mine and pulled me to the back of her little bedroom, shouting at my sister to follow us. The grating shriek rose. The thick walls of the soddy could do anything to soften it now. I sank onto the bed with Mrs. Frederickson pushed me down. My sister crouched on the floor, the lantern set beside her, her back against Mrs. Frederickson's big train trunk. Her eyes were closed. Mrs. Frederickson put her arm around my shoulders and held me tight against her as the wind smashed into the soddy, clawing, trying to get at us. I shouted to my sister, but my voice was silenced by the tearing roar of the wind. I reached out to take her hand, but she pulled it away, and I closed my eyes too. So that ends our chapter right in the middle of a tornado. My goodness. We're going to have to wait till tomorrow to find out what became of that. Hopefully, they'll all be okay and get through it, and their little soddy will hold up. That's their home. All right, everybody. Get a good night's sleep. Stay safe. Always be kind. And I'll meet you here tomorrow night for Chapter 2 of Hoofbeats.